The morning I found a yellow excavator chewing through my grandfather's silver maples, trees he'd planted with his own two hands the day the Korean War ended. I knew the Sun Valley Homeowners Association had just signed a death warrant for their own reputation, though they were too busy measuring property setbacks to realize it yet. You see, 6:15 a.m. isn't just a time for coffee and watching the mist roll off the hills of Montana. It's a time for quiet reflection. But that morning, the only thing reflecting was the sun off the hard hat of a foreman who looked like he'd never spent a day in actual dirt. I'm Wyatt Vance, 56, and I've run this 120-acre ranch since I was old enough to hold a fence stretcher. And if there's one thing a life of raising Black Angus and fixing broken machinery teaches you, it's that people who wear $800 boots usually have the softest hands and the loudest mouths. Standing there in the diesel fumes, I met Victoria Thorne, the HOA president and a woman who looks at a working ranch the way a cat looks at a vacuum cleaner, with a mixture of pure disdain and a desperate need to make it disappear. Victoria moved here 3 years ago from a corner office in Chicago, bought up the ridge overlooking my valley, and proceeded to build development of 400 cookie-cutter mansions that all look like they were designed by an architect who'd only ever seen the great outdoors on a screensaver. She stood there that morning, holding a clipboard like it was a holy relic, and told me that because of public necessity drainage easement, she'd lobbied the county for, they were running a massive steel pipeline straight through my north pasture to dump their golf course runoff into the creek my cattle have used for 70 years. My compensation? A measly $5,000 in, thank you for being a good neighbor, delivered with a smile so plastic I half expected it to melt in the sun. But here's the thing about Victoria and the rest of those Sun Valley elites. They see a man in stained Wranglers and a dusty Ford and they think uneducated, they think easy target, and they think I'm just a relic of a dying era who doesn't oppose to understand how the modern world works. What Victoria didn't oppose to know, what nobody in that polished, gated community knew, is that I've been playing a much longer game than a 3-year development cycle. Back in the late 90s, during the Great Drought that nearly wiped out every small holding in this county, I saw the writing on the wall regarding the most precious resource on this planet. So I took every cent of my savings and bought a tiny, crumbling private utility called Blue Ridge Waterworks. I tucked it under a quiet LLC named Silas Creek Holdings, hired a manager to keep the pipes pressurized, and stayed ghost owner, for 2 decades, providing water to 6 surrounding townships and, most importantly, the entire infrastructure for the Sun Valley estates. The day the pipeline went live, the peace of my ranch was shattered by the sound of gushing wastewater, and within 48 hours, my lead bull, a 2,000-pound beast named Tank, wooden and oppos, to go near the creek, just stood there bellowing at the water like it was poison. I didn't oppose to need a lab kit to know what was happening. I could smell the chlorine and the synthetic fertilizers from the golf course a mile away, and when I went to Victoria's office, a glass wall monstrosity that smells like expensive perfume and arrogance, she didn't oppose to even look up from her phone. She told me that Sun Valley represented progress and value and that if my livestock issues were so pressing, maybe I should consider selling the rest of my land to her for the Phase 2 expansion, an offer that was essentially pennies on the dollar. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice dripping with that patronizing sweetness, you have to understand that the needs of 400 families in a world-class fairway simply outweigh the needs of a few cows. It's just math, I left that office feeling a cold, quiet anger that's far more dangerous than the screaming kind, the kind of anger that makes you sit at your kitchen table until 3 in the morning with a stack of contracts and a flashlight. My wife, Sarah, who's been the stabilizing force of my life for 30 years, just set a cup of black coffee down and said, Wyatt, Don and Oppos, T just get mad, get even, and that when I pulled out the original 25-year service agreement for the Sun Valley development. Hidden deep in the environmental compliance section, page 42, clause 9, paragraph B, was a silver bullet that Victoria's high-priced lawyers must have skimmed over during the excitement of the groundbreaking. It stated that any customer found to be, in quote, knowingly introducing unrefined industrial or chemical runoff into the local watershed, in quote, was an immediate material breach, allowing the utility provider to not only escalate rates by 400% as a, end quote, remediation penalty, end quote, but to suspend service entirely if the violation was and oppose. T cured within 15 days. I didn't oppose. T call her, I didn't oppose. T ward her, I just sent a certified letter from Silas Creek Holdings, signed by my manager, notifying the Sun Valley HOA that their water rates were being adjusted effective immediately due to, end quote, documented watershed contamination, end quote. The bill I attached was for $98,000, covering the, end quote, emergency environmental assessment, end quote, and the retroactive penalty fees for the last 2 months of illegal dumping. Within an hour of that letter being delivered, my phone started vibrating so hard it nearly walked off the dashboard of my truck, but I just kept on greasing the bearings on my hay baler, enjoying the sound of the meadowlarks and the silence of my own refusal to answer. 2 days later, the real fun began when Victoria showed up at my gate, her Range Rover kicking up a cloud of dust that she usually complains about, and this time, the, end quote, plastic smile, end quote, was gone, replaced by a face the color of a ripe beet. She started screaming about, end quote, extortion, end quote, and, end quote, illegal price gouging, end quote, claiming she'd have my, end quote, little water company, end quote, shut down by the state by Monday morning, and I just leaned against my fence post, chewed on a piece of Timothy hay, and let her run out of breath. End quote. Victoria, end quote, I said quietly, end quote, I don't oppose. T own the company, Silas Creek Holdings does, but as a concerned neighbor, I did some digging, and it seems they've also flagged those 3 unpermitted irrigation wells you had drilled behind the clubhouse last summer. End quote. Her eyes went wide, that flicker of, end quote, oh no, end quote, finally crossing her face because in this part of the country, drilling into the aquifer without a state permit, ISN, and oppose. T just a fine. It's a felony that can result in the permanent revocation of all water rights for the entire property. The next week was a blur of high-stakes chess as I used my, end quote, ghost, end quote, position to leak the environmental reports to the local paper and the state EPA, while my lawyer filed a massive civil suit for the destruction of the maples and the poisoning of the creek. The Sun Valley Facebook group, which is usually a cesspool of people complaining about lawn heights, turned into a digital lynch mob as residents realized their property values were about to plummet to zero if the water was turned off. Victoria tried one last desperate move. She sent a group of, end quote, private security, end quote, guys to my ranch in the middle of the night to try and block the creek bypass I'd built. But they didn't oppose. T realized that a Montana rancher with a night vision scope and a very protective Great Pyrenees dog is a force of nature. I didn't oppose. T have to fire a shot. The sound of me racking a shell into my Remington and the dog's low chest vibrating growl was enough to make them decide that their hourly wage was an oppose. T nearly high enough for, end quote, tactical plumbing, end quote. The climax came at the emergency county board meeting, held in a gymnasium packed with 400 angry homeowners in North Face vests and Victoria Thorne sitting at the front, looking like she'd aged a decade in a week. My lawyer stood up and played the trail cam footage I'd gathered, clear, high-definition video of the HOA's own maintenance crew dumping bags of concentrated nitrate fertilizer directly into the pipeline access hatch during a rainstorm to, end quote, hide the evidence, end quote. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that usually precedes a riot, and then I stood up, walked to the microphone in my best clean denim, and looked Victoria straight in the eye. End quote. You told me it was just math, end quote. I said, my voice echoing off the gym walls, end quote. And the math says you owe this county a clean creek, you owe my ranch its trees back, and you owe your residents a new board of directors who actually knows how to follow the law, end quote. The aftermath was a landslide. The board voted to oust Victoria that night. The state EPA slapped the HOA with a 6-figure fine that they're still paying off, and part of the legal settlement required them to not only remove the pipeline, but to restore my north pasture and plant 50 mature silver maples to replace the ones they killed. I still own the water company, though I've since, end quote, revealed, end quote, myself to the new board, who now treats me with a level of respect that borders on fear, which is exactly how I like it. Every morning now, I sit on my porch with a coffee, looking at the ridge where those mansions sit, and I realize that Victoria was right about one thing. It is about the optics, and from where I'm sitting, the view of a clean creek and a growing grove of maples looks a whole lot better than a golf course. But it makes me wonder, in a world where everyone's trying to, end quote, develop, end quote, and, end quote, expand, end quote, and, end quote, optimize, end quote, what happens when the people who actually provide the lifeblood of a community, the water, the food, the land, finally decide they've had enough of being stepped on? Did I go too far by threatening the water supply of 400 families just to get back at one arrogant woman? Or is that the only language people like Victoria Thorne actually understand? I'd love to hear what you would have done if you were standing in my boots that morning, watching your legacy being chewed up by an excavator. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm a hero or just a stubborn old man with too much power.